It all started with an affair, a simple, illicit act between two people who should never have crossed that line. A housewife, a mother, who had been living a life that appeared to be perfect on the surface. Her marriage seemed stable, her family seemingly intact, but behind closed doors there was a secret, a dangerous secret that grew darker with each passing day. The 25-year-old stepson, the young man who had been raised in her household, became the object of her forbidden desires. What began as stolen glances turned into stolen moments, furtive meetings, desperate touches, and a growing passion that neither of them could control. But with every stolen kiss, every secret rendezvous, they both drifted further into dangerous territory. What happens when the lines between love, obsession, and betrayal begin to blur? If you are not an advocate of domestic violence, murder, inhumanity, abuse, to mention a few, hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Thank you. As the affair progressed, so did the consequences. What had started as a brief, lust-filled escape from reality soon turned into something much more complicated. The affair was no longer just about desire. It became about something else, something far darker, a pregnancy, a life growing inside her, a life that neither of them had planned for. The fear began to set in. The housewife, once in control of her own life, found herself spiraling. She had made a choice, an unforgivable one, and now there was no way out. The walls were closing in. She had to make a decision, one that could either end everything or, in her mind, fix it all. And then the inevitable happened. The decision was made, one final act, one act of desperation that would seal their fates forever. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about covering it up, about protecting the fragile life that was now inside her. What had once been a forbidden love became something far more dangerous. But the question remained, how far was she willing to go to protect the secret she had created? And when the truth came to light, it was worse than anyone had imagined. What had seemed like a terrible mistake, a forbidden love gone wrong, turned out to be something much darker, something far more tragic. A murder, a death so senseless, so brutal that it shocked everyone involved. The young man, driven by the same emotions that had started this twisted affair, would find himself caught in a web of lies and violence that he couldn't escape. And the housewife? She was no longer just a woman with a secret. The act that had begun as a means to conceal her shame turned into something that could never be undone. The life she had tried to protect, her own, was now in shambles. There was no turning back. The truth was out. The investigation began, and what they uncovered was more than anyone had anticipated. A trail of evidence, a series of lies, and the unraveling of a family's very foundation. But what was the real motivation behind this tragedy? Was it love? Obsession? A mother's desperate attempt to hold on to what she had, no matter the cost? The housewife and her stepson, both forever scarred by their actions, both trapped by the choices they had made. The affair had been their beginning, but the murder was their end. And the question remains, how far can you push the limits of love, obsession, and betrayal before it destroys you? And when it does, is there any way to redeem yourself? Angela Carter was 42 years old, a devoted wife, a mother, a woman whose life seemed from the outside like the very image of suburban comfort. She had married Charles Carter more than a decade ago, stepping into the role of wife and stepmother without hesitation. She was well-liked, the kind of woman who hosted book clubs, planned family vacations, and seemed to have everything under control. But beneath that controlled image was something else, something restless, a desire, a need, something that had been buried for years, waiting for the right moment to surface. And when it did, it came in the form of a man she should have never touched. Jason Carter had been just a teenager when Angela first entered his life. The son from Charles's previous marriage, he had grown up in the Carter household, splitting his time between his father and his biological mother. He was athletic, ambitious, full of the kind of energy that made people gravitate toward him. But as the years passed, as Jason grew into a man, something in their dynamic shifted. The boundaries blurred. He wasn't just a stepson anymore, at least not in Angela's eyes. And once the line was crossed, there was no going back. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss. Charles was a busy man, dedicated to his career in real estate, often working late hours or traveling to close deals. Angela was the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect mother. And Jason, now 25, was in the process of building his own life, working, dating, living the life of a young man with his future ahead of him. But behind closed doors, everything was different. There were glances that lasted too long, casual touches that lingered, late-night conversations that drifted into dangerous territory. And then, one night, the inevitable happened. It was supposed to be a mistake, a single moment of weakness. At least that's what Angela told herself. But mistakes don't happen over and over again. And soon, what started as a reckless impulse became something else entirely. They met in secret, stolen moments when Charles was away, carefully planned encounters where they could pretend for a little while that what they were doing wasn't completely wrong. But the deeper they fell into their deception, the harder it became to stop, and then came the moment that neither of them had prepared for. Angela was pregnant. It was a reality neither of them could ignore, a consequence that would unravel everything they had tried so desperately to keep hidden. The question wasn't just how to explain it, it was how to survive it, because now the affair wasn't just a secret, it was a ticking time bomb, one that could destroy them both. And as the weight of that realization set in, a far more dangerous thought began to take shape. How far would they go to keep the truth buried? At first, Angela Carter convinced herself it was nothing. A harmless attraction, a fleeting thought, something she could brush off. After all, Jason wasn't just any man. He was her stepson. She had helped raise him, watched him grow from a lanky teenager into the confident, well-built man he had become. He was 25 now, living under their roof temporarily, while he saved up for his own place. And yet, there was something about him. Something that made her pulse quicken in a way that she refused to acknowledge. At least not yet. Jason, for his part, had never thought of Angela that way. At least not consciously. She was his father's wife, the woman who had been in his life since he was a boy. But as he grew older, something shifted. He began to notice the way she carried herself, the way her laughter filled a room, the way her eyes locked onto his just a second too long. It was subtle, unspoken, but there was something there. And once he noticed it, he couldn't stop noticing. The first real moment between them happened on a quiet afternoon. Charles was out of town on business, and Jason had just finished a workout in the garage. He came inside, sweat still clinging to his skin, his t-shirt damp from exertion. Angela was in the kitchen sipping wine, scrolling absent-mindedly on her phone. She looked up when he entered, and for a second neither of them spoke. There was something different in the air that day. Something neither of them could name. Jason grabbed a bottle of water, leaned against the counter, and smirked at her. "You always drink wine this early?" he teased. Angela raised an eyebrow, swirling the deep red liquid in her glass. "Only when I need it." The way she said it, the way her voice dropped just slightly, it was the first time Jason saw her differently. Not as his stepmother, not as someone untouchable, but as a woman. It was Angela who crossed the first real line. One evening, after a dinner where Charles had excused himself early for a business call, Jason and Angela found themselves alone at the table, the only sounds the soft clinking of silverware against plates. Jason made a joke, something playful, something meaningless, but Angela laughed, her head tilting back slightly, exposing the curve of her neck. Without thinking, Jason reached out and touched her wrist just for a second. Angela froze. He did too. And then, slowly, she turned her hand over, letting his fingers graze against hers. It was the smallest thing, barely anything at all. But it was enough. Enough to make them both realize that whatever this was, it wasn't harmless anymore. From there, things escalated quickly. The first kiss happened late one night, long after Charles had gone to bed. Angela had been sitting on the couch flipping through channels when Jason came to join her. They sat in silence, the air thick with something unspoken. And then, as if some invisible force had pulled them together, their lips met. Soft at first, hesitant but then urgent, desperate, like they had been holding back for far too long. When they pulled away, Angela's breath was unsteady, her hands trembling against Jason's chest. "We can't," she whispered. But even as she said it, her fingers curled into his shirt as if anchoring herself to him, as if she already knew they had passed the point of no return. The secret meetings began soon after. Angela would send Charles off to work with a kiss, watching from the window as his car disappeared down the street. Then she would turn, and Jason would be there, waiting. They were careful, so careful. They timed everything perfectly. But secrets, no matter how well hidden, have a way of unraveling, and theirs was no different. What started as a small, forbidden spark was now a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. They told themselves it was just physical, that it didn't mean anything. But that was a lie, because with every stolen moment, every whispered promise, the feelings deepened. And with those feelings came something neither of them were ready for. Angela missed her period. At first, she ignored it. Stress, she told herself. Hormones. Nothing to worry about. But as the days passed, as nausea crept in and exhaustion settled over her, the truth became impossible to deny. She took a test one morning, locking herself in the bathroom while Jason waited outside, pacing. When she emerged, the color had drained from her face. She didn't have to say anything. Jason already knew. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela didn't answer. Because she didn't know. Because there was no answer that wouldn't destroy them both. And just like that, the affair was no longer just a secret. It was a time bomb. One that would eventually explode, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. The air in the room felt heavier, suffocating. She stared at the test, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. Jason knocked on the door, his voice low, cautious. "Angela?" She couldn't answer, couldn't move. Her hands trembled as she set the test down on the counter, the weight of it pressing against her chest like a stone. Jason knocked again, more urgently this time. Slowly, she turned the lock and opened the door. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding hers. He didn't need to ask. He saw the answer written all over her face. "Are you sure?" he whispered, as if saying it any louder would make it more real. Angela nodded. Jason exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He looked overwhelmed, scared, but there was something else there too, something deeper. A part of him that wasn't entirely upset by the idea. A part of him that saw this as more than just a mistake. But Angela didn't see it that way. She saw destruction, an unraveling that could not be undone. "What are we going to do?" he asked. "I don't know," she whispered. But she did know. There was no way this could continue. No way she could keep this hidden forever. At some point, someone would notice, someone would do the math, someone would figure it out, and then what? What would she say? What would she tell Charles? The next few weeks were torture. Every morning, Angela woke up with the same wave of panic, the same crushing realization that her time was running out. She avoided Charles as much as possible, feigning exhaustion, pretending to be too busy to sit with him at night the way they used to. But Charles wasn't stupid. He noticed the changes, the way she barely touched her wine anymore, the way she flinched when he reached for her. He asked her more than once if something was wrong. She lied. Over and over again she lied, because telling the truth wasn't an option. Jason, on the other hand, wanted to talk about it. He wanted to plan, to figure out what this meant for them. But Angela refused. The more he pushed, the more she withdrew. Because there was no them. There never had been. This was an affair, a mistake, something that was supposed to be temporary, fleeting. And yet, the proof of it was now growing inside her, a permanent reminder of what they had done. "Maybe we should leave," Jason suggested one night. They were sitting in his car, parked in an empty lot, away from prying eyes. Angela turned to him, her face unreadable. "Leave?" she repeated. "Yeah, you and me, we could start over somewhere else, no one would have to know." Angela stared at him, stunned. He was serious. He actually thought this could be something more, that they could just run away and pretend like none of this was wrong. She felt a wave of something. Pity, maybe. Because Jason didn't understand. He was young, naive enough to believe in second chances. But Angela knew better. There was no running from this. No escaping the consequences. And if she didn't do something soon, everything would come crashing down around them. But there was one problem she hadn't accounted for. Charles. He had started watching her. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that would make her immediately suspicious, but he was paying attention. He saw the way she jumped when he walked into a room unexpectedly, the way she pulled away from him at night, the way she seemed to disappear for hours at a time with no real explanation. And then there were the whispers, the ones he couldn't quite make out, the hurried conversations between Angela and Jason that stopped the second he entered the room. Something was wrong, and Charles was going to find out what it was. The moment of reckoning came late one evening. Angela was in the bathroom staring at herself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. Her reflection seemed foreign now, her body already beginning to change, betraying the secret she had worked so hard to keep. She had to decide soon. She had to choose what she was going to do. But before she could even take a breath, the bathroom door flew open. Charles stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. But his eyes told her everything. He knew, or at least he knew enough to suspect. "Angela," he said slowly, his voice unusually calm. "Are you pregnant?" Her heart stopped. Every muscle in her body went rigid. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came out. Charles took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Tell me the truth." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze, and in that moment, she realized something horrifying. He wasn't asking if she was pregnant. He was asking if the baby was his. Now faced with a secret too large to hide, a decision had to be made, one that would change everything. The night the murder happened, the air inside the Carter home felt different, heavy, tense. Angela could sense it from the moment she stepped through the front door. Charles was sitting in his usual chair in the living room, his eyes fixed on the television, but he wasn't really watching. His posture was too stiff, his grip on the remote too tight. Jason wasn't home yet. He was supposed to be meeting her later, somewhere away from the house, away from Charles. But as she stood there hanging up her coat, she had the distinct feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. "Dinner's on the stove," Charles said without looking at her. His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that sent a chill crawling up her spine. "Thanks," she murmured, moving toward the kitchen. She tried to act normal, to push down the anxiety clawing at her chest, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting. "Angela." She froze, her hand hovering over the pot on the stove. Slowly, she turned to face him. He was standing now, closer than she expected, his gaze dark and unreadable. "Are you going to tell me the truth?" he asked. Her heart pounded so hard she thought he might hear it. She opened her mouth, searching for an excuse, a lie that would get her out of this. But before she could speak, the front door swung open. Jason. He stepped inside, shaking off the chill of the night, but the second he saw his father's expression, Angela's frozen stance, he knew. Something was wrong. His body tensed, his eyes darting between them. "What's going on?" he asked carefully. Charles let out a low chuckle, a humorless sound that sent a wave of dread crashing over Angela. He turned toward Jason, shaking his head. "I should have seen it," he muttered. "The way you two looked at each other, the way you disappeared together. You really thought I wouldn't figure it out?" Jason's jaw tightened. He glanced at Angela, who was standing motionless, her breath shallow. She knew what Charles was capable of. He was a man who liked control, a man who didn't tolerate betrayal, and now he had been betrayed in the worst way imaginable. "Dad," Jason started, but Charles wasn't listening. "Is it true?" he asked, turning back to Angela. "Are you pregnant?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Angela's throat tightened, and for a split second she considered lying, but it was too late. Charles already knew. The confirmation was in her silence, in the way her body tensed, in the fear that flashed across her face. And then everything happened at once. Charles lunged, not at Angela, but at Jason. Jason barely had time to react before his father's hands were on him, shoving him backward, slamming him against the wall. A picture frame crashed to the floor. Angela screamed, rushing forward, trying to pull Charles away, but he was wild with rage. His fists flew, one, then another, connecting with Jason's jaw, his ribs. Jason fought back, pushing his father off him, but Charles was stronger than he looked, and he was furious. "You slept with my wife," Charles roared, his voice breaking. "You got her pregnant." "Stop," Angela begged, grabbing at Charles's arm. "Please, stop." But he wouldn't. He couldn't. The betrayal was too much, the humiliation unbearable. In his mind, there was only one way to make this right. Angela saw it before Jason did. The glint of metal as Charles reached behind his back, pulling the gun from his waistband. A gun he had kept in the house for years, for protection. A gun that was now aimed directly at his own son. "No!" Angela screamed, lunging forward. Jason's eyes widened, his hands coming up instinctively, but it was too late. A single gunshot rang through the house. For a moment, everything was still. Jason staggered backward, a look of shock crossing his face. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands went to his stomach, pressing against the rapidly spreading stain of red. And then, as if in slow motion, his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the floor. "Oh my God," Angela whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. "Oh my God, no, no, no." Jason's breaths were shallow, his eyes fluttering, his body shaking. Angela pressed her hands to the wound, desperately trying to stop the bleeding, but there was too much blood. Too much damage. Charles stood above them, the gun still clutched in his shaking hands. His chest heaved, his expression blank, as if he couldn't quite comprehend what he had done. And then, slowly, he took a step back. Then another. The realization hit him like a truck. He had just shot his own son. Call an ambulance," he stammered. Angela fumbled for her phone, her hands slick with Jason's blood, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The seconds stretched into eternity as she pressed the phone to her ear, her voice barely recognizable when she finally spoke. "Help! Please! My son! He's been shot!" The dispatcher's voice was calm, instructing her to stay on the line, but Angela barely heard it. All she could focus on was Jason, his skin pale, his lips parted as he tried to speak. "Angela," he choked out. "Shh, don't talk," she begged, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Just hold on, okay? Help is coming." But deep down, she knew the truth. He wasn't going to make it. By the time the police arrived, Jason was gone. Angela sat on the floor, her hands stained red, her body shaking violently. Charles stood motionless, staring at nothing. When the officers burst through the door, guns drawn, he didn't resist. He simply held up his hands, his face devoid of emotion. "It was an accident," he murmured. "I didn't mean to." But it didn't matter. Jason was dead. And nothing would change that. The investigation that followed was swift. The police pieced together the truth quickly. An affair, a pregnancy, a confrontation that ended in blood. Charles was arrested that night, charged with second-degree murder. Angela, though devastated, was forced to answer for her part in it all. The trial was brutal. The prosecution painted Charles as a jealous, vengeful husband who had snapped when he learned of the affair. The defense argued that it was a crime of passion, a moment of blind rage that he regretted instantly. But no matter how it was spun, one fact remained. Charles Carter had pulled the trigger, and Jason was dead because of it. Angela sat in the courtroom every day, numb. She had lost everything. Jason, her marriage, her future. The child growing inside her would never know its father, would never know the man Jason had been. And that, more than anything, was the cruelest punishment of all. In the end, Charles was convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to 25 years behind bars. But for Angela, the real sentence was living with what she had done, with the choices that had led to that fateful night, with the weight of a love that never should have been, and the life it had cost. This case leaves us with more questions than answers. Was this truly just a crime of passion, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? Charles Carter pulled the trigger, yes. But was he the only one responsible for what happened that night? Some argue that Jason wasn't as innocent as he seemed. A 25-year-old man engaging in a relationship with his stepmother. Was it really just about love, or was there manipulation at play? Did Jason willingly pursue this relationship knowing the risks, or was he caught in something he couldn't escape? And what about Angela? Did she ever consider the consequences, or was she simply blinded by desire? And then, there's the question of the unborn child. Had Charles not discovered the affair that night? What would have happened? Would Angela have left him? Would Jason have stepped up as a father? Or was he just as unprepared for the fallout as she was? These are the questions that haunt those who followed the case, and now I turn to you. What do you think? Did Charles act in a blind moment of rage, or was this something he had been stewing over for a long time? Did Angela manipulate Jason, using him as an escape from a failing marriage? Or was Jason the one who seduced her, knowing the power he held over his stepmother? And could this tragedy have been avoided if just one person had made a different choice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe this was an inevitable disaster waiting to happen, or could something, anything, have stopped it? Affairs within families are more common than people realize. Studies show that extramarital affairs account for nearly 20% of divorces in the U.S. But when you introduce step families into the equation, the lines become even more blurred. In fact, psychologists suggest that the taboo surrounding step-family relationships can sometimes fuel attraction rather than prevent it. And crimes of passion? They make up nearly 30% of domestic homicides. The emotions run high, the betrayal cuts deep, and before anyone has time to think, a single moment of rage turns deadly. We've seen it before. Husbands killing wives, wives killing husbands, and in this case, a father killing his own son. But here's a question for you. Do you think Charles deserved his sentence? Manslaughter, 25 years. Some argue that he got off easy, that a man who takes a life, especially that of his own son, should never walk free again. Others say he wasn't a cold-blooded killer, just a broken man who lost control. Where do you stand? And what about Angela? Legally, she wasn't held accountable for Jason's death. But morally, should she have been? Some say her choices set this tragedy in motion. Others believe she was just as much a victim as Jason, trapped in a situation she never intended to go this far. What do you think? If you are not an advocate of domestic violence, murder, inhumanity, abuse to mention a few, hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. Thank you.